You were shaped in a world that didn't slow down for you, didn't cushion anything for you, and definitely didn't walk you through the hard parts gently. But before life got complicated, you lived in a time that had its own unmistakable feel. A childhood that existed before everything turned digital, before everything was supervised, and before the world became loud in the way it is today. If you grew up Gen X, you remember the world before the internet, not as history, but as your actual life. You remember blowing into Nintendo cartridges to revive Super Mario, hoping Blockbuster still had the new release on the shelf, and listening to music on a boombox you practically had to babysit. You rode your bike everywhere without calling anyone to say you arrived safely. Your parents didn't track your location. Half the time, they didn't even know where you were. Saturday mornings meant cartoons that aired once. No rewinds, no streaming. Toys didn't talk, blink, or connect to Wi-Fi. You had G.I. Joe, Cabbage Patch Kids, Rainbow Bright, He-Man, and My Little Pony. You had metal Tonka trucks that could survive a nuclear blast, big wheels with wheels worn flat on one side, and an Etch-a-Sketch that built your patience more than your art skills. You drank hose water. You rode in the back of pickup trucks without a thought. You survived playgrounds made of blistering hot metal that could double as medieval torture devices. And somehow, everyone lived to tell the story. Your childhood wasn't perfect, but it was real, textured, a little chaotic, filled with boredom that forced creativity, freedom that required instincts, and long afternoons spent outside until the streetlights told you to come home. That world shaped you. But beneath all that nostalgia was a much harder truth. You entered a world unraveling and rebuilding at the same time. The adults around you were stretched thin, juggling economic stress, shifting family dynamics, cultural upheaval, and political tension. They didn't always have the capacity to notice how much pressure you were absorbing. But kids, especially Gen X kids, always notice more than they're given credit for. The late 1960s through the early 1980s were not gentle years. Inflation spiked, jobs were unstable. The Cold War hovered in the background like a storm cloud no one could escape. The optimism of the post-war era was fading, and families were reinventing themselves in ways society wasn't prepared for. Divorce rates climbed, roles changed, stability cracked, and you, small but observant, felt all of it. The boomer generation before you grew up in a world that said, "You are the future." You grew up in a world that essentially said, "You'll figure it out." And you did. You also became the first major wave of latchkey kids, a detail that shaped you more than most people realize. You wore your house key like a badge of responsibility, letting yourself inside after school to a quiet house. You made your own snacks, did your homework alone, and lived afternoons without a single adult checking in. That solitude didn't scare you, it trained you. You learned independence before you learned long division. You learned emotional containment before you learned how to explain your feelings. You learned to be okay being alone, not because it was relaxing, but because it was normal. That independence became so deeply wired into you that even now, you forget it's unusual. You didn't need praise and attention. You didn't need someone hovering over you. You learned to stand on your own legs because they were the only legs available. At the same time, your generation was living through the height of the stranger danger era, missing kids on milk cartons, news reports that played like cautionary tales. You were told constantly, don't talk to strangers, don't get into anyone's car, be alert, pay attention. And yet, you walked home alone every day. You grew up with fear and freedom woven together. A strange combination, but you developed instincts, discernment, the ability to read people quickly. You trusted slowly because you learned early that caution was survival. You learned to rely on your gut because your gut was often the only warning system you had. And that trait followed you into adulthood. You know when something feels off before you can explain it. You keep your inner circle small and deeply loyal, and you learned that trust is a gift, not a guarantee. Gen X also learned practical responsibility at an age when most kids today are still being chauffeured to everything. You cooked, cleaned, fixed, problem solved, and handled tasks that were way beyond your age. You didn't help with chores. You did them because someone had to. You didn't ask for instructions. Half the time there were none. You just figured it out. This created a generation of adults who are outrageously capable. You became the "I'll take care of it" person long before adulthood arrived. You became calm under pressure because pressure was the background noise of your childhood. You learned to prioritize, adjust, and push forward even when you had no idea what the plan was. But being strong that early always comes with a cost. You learn to hide fear. You learn to mask stress. You learn to handle things alone because who else was going to handle them? You learn to keep going even when you were overwhelmed. And that early emotional load created a pattern you still carry, the one where people assume you're fine because you always look fine. And while you were doing all of this, the world around you was breaking and rebuilding institutions in real time. You watched political scandals that shattered public trust. You saw the Challenger disaster unfold on live TV in classrooms. You witnessed recessions, layoffs, environmental warnings, and shifts in global tension. You saw adults pretending everything was under control when it clearly wasn't. So you learned early, authority doesn't equal competence. Leaders aren't always reliable. Systems don't always protect people. You didn't rebel for rebellion's sake. You questioned because questioning made sense. Your skepticism wasn't a flaw. It was intelligence built from experience. Your humor developed alongside all of this, the kind of humor that says, "Life's weird, but here we are." It wasn't dark or bitter. It was honest, grounded, practical. It helped you carry things that didn't have easy answers. It helped you keep going without falling apart. And sometimes, it helped you avoid emotions you didn't have time to process. Then came the generational squeeze. Boomers before you, millennials after you, both massive, both loud, both culturally dominant. Gen X, smaller in number, quieter in approach, and so capable that no one ever stopped to ask if you needed anything. You became the stabilizers, the rope holders between two loud ends of history. You adapted. You didn't complain. You didn't demand the spotlight. You didn't create chaos. You handled things silently and efficiently. And now, as adults, you show up exactly as your childhood shaped you to. Independent, because relying on yourself was the only option. Private, because your emotions were always yours to manage. Observant, because your safety once depended on staying alert. Loyal, because trust is rare and meaningful. Skeptical, because you've seen too much to be easily convinced. Hardworking, because if you didn't do it, it didn't get done. Calm in crisis, because crisis was your normal. But beneath all that capability is a quiet truth, one you rarely say out loud. You grew up too early. You carried weight too soon. You didn't have the emotional safety net other generations grew up expecting. You became strong because you had no choice. You became self-contained because no one taught you how to be anything else. None of this makes you weak or distant. It makes you understandable. Your strength has a story. Your independence has roots. Your resilience has a history. And it deserves to be seen clearly. You didn't become this way by accident. You were shaped by a world in transition, a world breaking old systems faster than it could build new ones. And somehow, in all of that instability, you found your footing. You stabilized yourself. You adapted. You survived. And more importantly, you grew. You're the generation that learned to survive without applause, to take responsibility without recognition, and to keep going even when no one noticed. You're the generation that learned life doesn't hand you clarity. You carve it out yourself. If any part of this feels familiar, that's because your childhood wrote the opening chapters of how your mind works today. And those chapters matter. If you'd like more deep dives like this, go ahead and subscribe.